It was once labeled the Battle of Funk. But what started as healthy competition slowly twisted into open warfare. According to people who were there, the two men would lurk in the wings, watching every second of each other's sets. Rick James complained that Prince was stealing everything: his stage moves, his leather and chains look, even his idea for a female group. Behind the bright lights, there was already a fracture spreading through the heart of funk that, in Rick's eyes, America never really confronted. Values were changing, respect was vanishing, and one night turned that quiet fracture into a permanent scar. The feud between Rick James and Prince wasn't just about music charts or costume choices. It became a dark wound in the story of American funk. According to Rick, it all crystallized in one brutal moment. When Prince allegedly answered his senior's swagger with an act so icy, it turned a backstage space into a battlefield and transformed a fellow performer into a lifelong enemy. From that second on, Rick James, the self-proclaimed king of punk funk, could only grit his teeth and swear he would never forgive. So what exactly did Prince do that made Rick decide this was an unforgivable betrayal? Believe it or not, many people close to the scene say it all started with a single glass of cognac. October 1979, Detroit, Michigan. The city pulsed with anticipation as Rick James launched his Fire It Up tour. This was the moment he was sure he'd reached his summit. Cobo Arena was packed wall to wall, tens of thousands chanting his name like a war cry. Rick strutted out in skin-tight leather, wild hair framing his face, bass slung low across his body like a weapon ready for combat. In his mind, no one could touch that flame, much less steal it. But in the shadows just off stage, someone else was waiting for their chance. That someone was Prince. Young, recently signed, and, according to accounts from the tour, brought in as the opening act at the label's suggestion. At first, Rick felt almost paternal. He reportedly told friends, "I'm giving this kid a chance. Let him see what a real crowd feels like." In Rick's head, he was the mentor, and Prince was just a rookie getting a brief glimpse of the big leagues. Opening night in Detroit shattered that illusion. At exactly 7:45 p.m., Prince walked on stage in a tight purple jumpsuit, eyes cool and unreadable. He plugged his guitar into the amp, let loose a burst of electric chords, and then launched into bold, unexpected dance moves under neon lights. The crowd, who had ostensibly packed the arena for Rick James, suddenly erupted for this stranger. They screamed Prince's name. They danced like the main act had already arrived. What was supposed to be a warm-up act turned into a shockwave. From backstage, Rick watched in disbelief, biting down hard on his lip. Pride, just moments before overflowing, twisted into something else, an uneasy, crawling sense that this kid was a real threat. "This is my tour," he thought. Why are they yelling for him? The Fire It Up tour rolled through the winter of 1979 into early 1980, Detroit, Chicago, Dallas, New Orleans, city after city. The pattern repeated. Prince, the opener, kept hijacking the spotlight. Local papers even started printing lines that stung like a knife. The real star of the show, they claimed, was the opening act, not the headliner. Those sentences dug into Rick like a blade. On the tour bus, he poured his frustration onto anyone near him, crew members, assistants, bandmates snapping over minor mistakes, repeating that he couldn't allow some kid to outshine him on his own stage. Meanwhile, Prince barely spoke. He reportedly sat in corners with dark sunglasses on, even in dimly lit rooms, communicating with glances instead of words. To Rick, that silence felt like arrogance, like a quiet reminder that the rising star didn't consider him an equal, but an obstacle. By February 1980, after a show at the LA Forum, things finally broke. Backstage was crowded friends, groupies, managers, techs weaving around crates and cables. Rick, drunk on liquor and adrenaline, clutched a glass of amber cognac. He scanned the room and spotted Prince leaning alone against a wall, expression impossible to read. Rick staggered toward him, voice rough and slurred. "Hey, you think you're cool? Just because the crowd screams doesn't mean you're better than me." Witnesses recall the room tightening, conversations dropping off mid-sentence. Prince didn't reply. He simply lifted his head, gave Rick a cold, piercing look, and then turned away as if he hadn't heard a word. The room went dead silent. The air felt thick, heavy. Then Rick snapped. In a burst of rage, he lifted his glass and tipped the cognac over Prince's head. The liquor poured through Prince's hair, soaking his purple suit, the smell of alcohol filling the room. The glass slipped from Rick's hand and shattered against the floor. No one moved. Eyes darted between the two men, waiting for the explosion, shoving, punches, screaming. But Prince didn't raise a fist. He stood completely still as the liquid dripped down his face and clothes. Then, without a word, he locked his dark eyes on Rick for a few long seconds, turned his back, and walked straight out of the room. Only murmurs and the clink of broken glass remained. That wordless response cut deeper than a fight ever could. Rick felt no release, no satisfaction, only a hollow, burning humiliation. His rage spilled out as he yelled, "Who the hell does he think he is?" But by then, Prince had already disappeared into the dim hallway. According to Rick's own 2014 memoir, Glow, that night was the true beginning of the feud. It was no longer about being annoyed by an up-and-coming act. In his mind, it became an open wound, a humiliation he couldn't swallow. From 1980 onward, Rick refused to see Prince as a junior or a colleague. He saw him as a rival who had to be put back in his place. Yet, even before the cognac had fully dried from Prince's purple outfit, another blow landed. This one came from someone Rick believed he could trust with everything. Her name was Denise Matthews. Rick first encountered Denise at a wild party in Toronto at the end of 1979, a haze of cocaine, loud live music, and laughter. She was a Canadian girl with sharp, bright eyes and a striking figure, and she captured Rick's attention immediately. He swept her into his world, brought her to Los Angeles, set her up in a mansion, gave her cars and jewelry, and promised to transform her into a star. To Rick, Denise was not just a lover. She was the centerpiece of his Mary Jane Girls concept, the all-female group he was crafting to prove he could dominate not only as a performer, but as a producer and mastermind. She was the living symbol of his million-dollar ambition. But while Rick was consumed by touring and intoxication, Prince quietly drew closer to Denise. They reportedly crossed paths at backstage hangouts, after-parties, and studio sessions. Then came the twist Rick never saw coming. Prince invited Denise to his world, to his private studio, Paisley Park. There, she heard his unfinished demos for the first time. They weren't like Rick's hard street funk. Prince's tracks hinted at a different universe. Sensual, icy, mysterious, almost otherworldly. Denise felt the pull. Those sessions planted a seed that would grow into Rick's worst nightmare. The 19th of January, 1980. American Music Awards, Los Angeles. Rick arrived with Denise on his arm, chest out, convinced Hollywood was witnessing his arrival as a powerhouse. In his mind, this was his victory lap success. A beautiful partner, a budding girl group. What he didn't realize was that whispers were already swirling among industry insiders. They sensed an invisible triangle forming between Rick, Denise, and Prince. When the ceremony ended, Rick strode out, reveling in the attention. Minutes later, the energy shifted. People started murmuring. Denise was nowhere to be seen. According to witnesses, she had been spotted stepping into a sleek black limousine. Inside, waiting quietly, was Prince. In one move, Rick didn't just lose his partner. He lost her in front of the industry, under the bright glare of Hollywood's biggest stage. News raced through the music world. Denise Matthews, the woman Rick had showcased and protected, had left him for his rival. In the months that followed, Prince didn't stop at romance. He rewrote Denise's entire identity. He renamed her Vanity, created the group Vanity 6 around her, and turned her into the face of a very different project. Where Rick had envisioned the Mary Jane Girls as a reflection of his punk-funk sensibility, Vanity 6 leaned into something far more explicit. The group's image revolved around provocation. Women in silky nightgowns, singing boldly sensual lyrics, performing with an unapologetically sexual edge. In Rick's eyes, this was a ruthless transformation of his dream into Prince's weapon, a way to flaunt his power and overshadow Rick's original vision. The press pounced. Headlines mocked the situation, pointing out that while Rick had talked about the Mary Jane girls, it was Prince who had actually launched Vanity 6, and the audience, they implied, had already chosen their favorite. For Rick, it was a stain he couldn't wash off. In less than half a year, he believed he had lost his lover, his flagship project, and a chunk of his pride all to the same man. Rick thought losing Denise was the fatal blow. But instead of collapsing, he tried to turn humiliation into fuel. In 1981, he released Street Songs, an album that shook America, from Los Angeles boulevards where Cadillacs blasted Super Freak, to Harlem bars spinning Give It To Me Baby on repeat. The sound was everywhere. Within months, Rick did what many black artists of the time struggled to do. He broke through onto MTV, a channel heavily dominated by white rock acts. Interviews showed him with red-rimmed eyes, a cocky grin, cigarette in hand, declaring himself once again the king of punk funk. For a moment, it felt like revenge. He had turned pain into platinum and reclaimed the crown. In his mind, he had answered the insult named Vanity. But history wasn't done with him. While Rick burned hot in the spotlight, another force was quietly assembling something bigger. The name was still the same. Prince. October 1982. Prince dropped 1999. Even its title sounded like a prophecy. The sound had evolved no longer just funk, but a fusion of pop, rock, new wave, icy drum machines, and futuristic synthesizers. The image of Prince in a tight purple outfit, cruising beside a blazing red Corvette, gripped young America. Not just black audiences. White teenagers, too, locked onto him as a symbol of something new. Little Red Corvette raced up the Billboard charts. 1999 turned into an anthem for an entire generation's parties. Prince hadn't just joined the funk conversation. He had pushed beyond it, into crossover territory Rick had never fully captured. The media saw their angle immediately. Stories framed it as a duel. Rick James, king of punk funk, versus Prince, the purple prodigy. On one side, the street-hardened ruler of raw funk. On the other, the boundary-smashing young genius. Fans loved the narrative. For Rick, reading those articles felt like getting slapped in the face. He thought back to the Fire It Up tour, to the kid in the purple jumpsuit watching from the shadows. Now, everything Rick felt, he'd pioneered leather outfits, chains. Certain stage moves seemed to reappear in Prince's visuals. In a summer 1982 interview with Rolling Stone, Rick openly accused Prince of copying him. He claimed Prince had borrowed his black leather looks, his chained stage gear, even his signature head tosses. "I saw him learning my moves right backstage," Rick reportedly growled. "Now he's using them like they belong to him." He didn't stop there. On MTV, Rick continued the offensive, mocking Prince's colorful jumpsuits, high heels, and body-bearing costumes, insisting he had been doing that years before. Bitterly, he argued that even some of Prince's early guitar riffs sounded like echoes of his own track, Bustin' Out of L7. In Rick's mind, the TV screen turned into a courtroom, and the viewers were the jury in a case of artistic theft. What he didn't anticipate was Prince's answer, or rather, his refusal to give one. Prince stayed silent. No interviews, no direct clapbacks, no public war of words. He let 1999 and Little Red Corvette play endlessly on MTV, flooding bedrooms and living rooms in purple light. That silence, once again, became a weapon. While Rick shouted into microphones, Prince became the enigmatic genius, praised for his creativity. Gradually, the public started to see Rick as angry and resentful, while Prince's mystique only grew stronger. On stage, the contrast was stark. Rick James poured sweat, attacking each lyric like he was fighting off a world that wanted to erase him. Crowds were hyped, but they were watching a man desperate to prove he still mattered. Prince, by comparison, seemed almost effortless. He stepped into the spotlight, bathed in purple glow, barely straining, and still the arenas detonated with screams. One man demanded the crown. The other seemed to receive it without asking. By late 1982, an uncomfortable truth had formed. Rick had Street Songs, but Prince had 1999. and with it, a broader, more powerful future. Rick could rule the turf of hardcore funk, but Prince was constructing something larger, a global empire of sound and image. Hollywood insiders began to whisper a new question. Who was the real king of funk? The feud had risen to another level. It was no longer just about a spilled drink, a stolen lover, or bruised ego. It had become a war, fought through magazine covers, talk shows, MTV rotation, and the eyes of millions of fans. The more Rick lashed out, the more he seemed consumed by bitterness. The more Prince maintained his cold silence, the more untouchable he looked. And still, this was not the breaking point. Everything that happened in those 2 years was just the prelude to a larger, darker confrontation, one that would unfold in front of tens of thousands and drag their private hatred into the center of the world's biggest stages. It was the 10th of July, 1983, a suffocating summer night in New York City. Madison Square Garden turned into what many fans called the Cathedral of Funk as Rick James brought his cold-blooded tour to town. More than 15,000 people filled the arena, lights slashing across the darkness while the crowd screamed his name. For Rick, this night was supposed to be a coronation, a final, undeniable proof that after all the storms, he still wore the crown. He didn't come alone. That night, Rick James brought his family, including the woman whose name had followed him since Detroit's rough streets, his mother, Mary Jane. For Rick, walking into Madison Square Garden with his mother watching from the stands was more than a career milestone. It was evidence that her black son, who had grown up in poverty, had climbed to the absolute peak. Mary Jane had a simple but cherished habit. She collected autographs like small trophies of a life spent in the shadow of stages. Over the years, touring with her son, she had compiled dozens of signatures, each one carefully saved. That night, after Rick's explosive performance, she saw Prince in the hallway. She knew Rick despised him. But to her, this was just another famous musician, another name to add to her quiet collection. Clutching her program, she walked up to him, hoping for a brief, polite moment. Prince stopped. His eyes swept over her, cool and distant. For a few seconds, it looked like he would sign. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pen, lifted his hand as if to put his signature on the page, and then, suddenly, he let the program fall. It slipped from his fingers, landed on the damp hallway floor, and lay there, abandoned. According to witnesses, Prince muttered, "I don't know who you are," before turning away and walking off. The paper was trampled and smeared as people passed. The air split open. Mary Jane froze, her hands shaking as she bent down to pick up the crumpled program. Around her, gasps and whispers flared like sparks. This wasn't just someone refusing to sign. It was a dismissal, a public humiliation in a place where her son was supposed to be king. Rick James saw it. Only a few steps away, he watched his mother standing there, humiliated, clutching the ruined program. Something inside him snapped. He lunged toward Prince, roaring with a fury that had been building for years. Security and staff rushed in. It took 3 bodyguards and a manager to hold him back. He thrashed against them, face flushed, shirt soaked in sweat, eyes wide and wild like an animal trapped in a cage. Prince never turned around. He walked slowly down the hallway, his purple silhouette shrinking as he disappeared behind a steel door. The only things left were the echoes of Rick's curses and an elderly woman holding a wrinkled program that would never bear a signature. Later, Prince would explain, according to reports, that he believed Mary Jane was one of the autograph hustlers who prowled New York arenas, gathering autographs only to resell them for cash. Manhattan was full of people like that, and Prince had grown cautious. But whatever his reasoning, that explanation didn't matter to Rick James. What mattered was what had happened in that hallway, in front of witnesses. To Rick, the moment at Madison Square Garden wasn't just a slight. It was an insult to his mother's dignity, delivered on the very night she came to see him at his greatest. That gesture, dropping her program onto the filthy floor and walking away, cut deeper than all the previous slights, deeper than the cognac, deeper than the stolen lover, deeper than the headlines. It felt like a declaration of war. From that night on, their feud was no longer about backstage friction or accusations of stealing style. It wasn't even just about a love triangle or industry politics. In Rick's world, what happened at Madison Square Garden turned their rivalry into blood hatred, the kind of offense that, in street code, cannot be forgiven. Rick James no longer saw Prince as another artist competing for the same spotlight. He saw him as a man who had disrespected his family, someone who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In Rick's mind, they could no longer share the same sky. One of them had to be brought down. From that point forward, Rick was a fuse waiting to be lit, anger coiled just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any perceived slight. And Prince? He remained what he had always been in this story, silent, distant, dangerous in a way that didn't require shouting. He wielded silence like a blade, letting his refusal to engage become the cruelest answer of all. At that moment, in the corridors of Madison Square Garden, two legends stopped being rivals and became something else, entirely eternal enemies. And when Rick James truly decided someone was his enemy, one question always followed. How far would he go to strike back? After Madison Square Garden, nothing between them was casual anymore. Every move, every gesture, every night on stage turned into another blow in a war that neither man was willing to end. The funk world didn't know it yet, but it was quietly entering what later would be remembered as the Funk Wars, a conflict without bullets or knives, but full of scars that would never fully heal. Rick James chose the most direct path: open attack. In September 1983, at Joe Louis Arena in Detroit, he decided to send a message so clear no one could miss it. When the curtain rose, fans saw a massive backdrop hanging behind the band. On one side, a glowing image of the Mary Jane Girls. On the other, Vanity 6. Red stage lights washed over the banner, making it look like a showdown poster. The crowd roared as Rick stepped to the microphone, eyes blazing, and growled into it. The real thing is right here. Detroit didn't just watch a concert that night. They watched a shot fired straight at Prince's camp. But Rick wasn't done. In April 1984, at Chicago Stadium, he staged something much darker. During a performance of Super Freak, a dancer stumbled onto the stage dressed in an exaggerated parody of Prince. Torn purple clothes, oversized high heels, wobbling dramatically with every step, the audience instantly recognized the target. As the band jammed, Rick moved toward the fake Prince and, in a choreographed moment, kicked him into the band pit. The crowd exploded, half in laughter, half in shock. The next day, newspapers leaned into the story. They wrote that Rick James hadn't just mocked his rival, he had turned the stage into a battlefield of ridicule. What had once been a private feud was now a public spectacle, amplified by every headline. Still, the worst was yet to come. June 1985. The Forum in Los Angeles. It was the opening night of the Purple Rain Tour. The entire city seemed to revolve around one location. More than 15,000 people poured toward the venue. Limousines jammed Prairie Avenue, cameras flashed, and the press breathlessly called it Prince's coronation, the kind of night that could define a decade. Record executives hovered like hawks, declaring it the biggest gamble and greatest event of its time. Backstage pulsed like a nervous system on overload. Technicians rushed equipment down narrow hallways, dancers adjusted their revealing costumes in front of spotted mirrors, and the band ran through final tuning. The air buzzed with excitement. Then, suddenly, the room changed. 4 workers walked in, carrying something huge and white, a massive funeral wreath edged in purple. They placed it at the main passageway leading to the stage, right where Prince and his crew would have to pass. Anyone looking at it could see immediately that this was no celebratory decoration. Pinned to it was a small black ribbon, and on that ribbon, in cold silver letters, were the words, "Rest in peace to the Prince of Funk from the King." Witnesses said the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop. People stared, frozen, as whispers tore through the backstage crowd. A dancer reportedly muttered under her breath, "Oh God." Rick James. Prince's manager, Steve Fargnoli, reacted fast, ordering staff to get the wreath out of sight. But the damage had already been done. Everyone there had read the message. This wasn't just a prank. It was a death omen delivered on the night Prince was supposed to step into superstardom. Then Prince saw it. He stopped in front of the wreath, eyes locked on the card. The hallway went quiet enough to hear the hum of amps in the distance. One staff member later recalled that his face barely shifted, but something in the air around him turned ice cold. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't break anything. He just stared, turned away, clenched his gloved hand, and walked back into his dressing room. Outside, fans screamed and chanted his name, unaware that backstage, a psychological knife had just been plunged. If the cognac incident in 1980 had been about embarrassment and Vanity had been about betrayal, then the funeral wreath at the opening of the Purple Rain tour was something more. It was an attack on Prince's honor, on the myth he had painstakingly built. It mocked his title, his identity, his rise. It suggested that on the very night he was meant to be crowned, someone else, the king, was pronouncing him dead. From that moment, there was no real path back to peace. Funk had entered its own Cold War. Rick provoked aggressively, using spectacle, mockery, and symbolism. Prince swallowed each insult without public outburst, turning his response into something more sinister strategy. He didn't scream. He calculated. When Rick announced an East Coast tour, Prince made his move. According to industry chatter, Prince deliberately scheduled his hit-and-run shows in the same cities on the same nights as Rick's dates. On the surface, it could be written off as coincidence. The press even framed it that way. But for Rick James, there was nothing accidental about it. He saw a razor drawn right across his wallet and his pride. Every city that chose Prince's show over his, every sold-out crowd that went to the purple side instead of the punk-funk king, felt like a direct hit to his survival. The quiet war escalated again in October 1987 at First Avenue in Minneapolis, the same club that had become legendary in Prince's story. That night, Prince walked on stage wearing tight black leather, a silver chain slung across his chest. To casual fans, it was just another striking outfit. To Rick James, watching from a distance, it was a message written in metal and leather. He had always claimed that look, that leather and chain image, as one of his trademarks. Now, seeing it on Prince in his own hometown venue was like hearing a sentence spoken without words. I can take everything you say is yours and make it mine. The crowd roared as Prince moved with ease under the lights, feeding off the energy. From miles away, Rick heard the reports and felt the air tightening around his legacy. A year later, in Los Angeles in 1988, strange flyers began appearing around the Hollywood Palladium before one of Rick's shows. They were stark, simple, and unmistakable. An upside-down crown. Beneath it, a phrase printed in bold letters. Only one true Prince. No one publicly took credit. No signatures, no logos, no official claim, but almost no one in the scene doubted who the message favored or who it mocked. By the late 1980 seconds, what started as a personal feud had grown into something bigger, something cultural. The press rarely mentioned one name without the other. Rick James and Prince had become two sides of a single story. Genius and resentment. Noise and silence. Fire and ice. Fans took sides. Writers built careers, retelling their clashes and contradictions. Rick continued to storm into interviews, calling Prince overrated, fake, a manufactured star inflated by hype. He aired his anger on camera, on radio, on any stage that would hand him a microphone. Prince, as always, stayed mostly quiet, letting albums, tours, and his chokehold on MTV write his side of the story. As time went on, a cruel pattern appeared. The more furiously Rick talked, the more he looked trapped in his own anger. The more Prince refused to engage, the more people praised him as a mysterious genius above petty drama. Each silence from him made Rick's outbursts seem louder and more painful. From the mock backdrops to the fake Prince on stage, from the funeral wreath to the overlapping tour dates and anonymous flyers with overturned crowns, each act was another cut. Another line of red carved into the history of American music. The funk wars weren't just a rivalry between two talented men. They became a mirror reflecting what happens when pride, power, and wounded egos collide. They showed that in the glittering world of stardom, some conflicts don't fade when the spotlight dims. They linger in the shadows, shaping careers, choices, and legacies long after the last encore. So the question remained. As the years rolled forward, did time soften that hatred? Or did it simply deepen the abyss between Rick James and Prince, turning a feud into something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives? So, did that hatred ever fade as the years rolled by? Or did time only carve the gap between them even deeper? By the 1,990 seconds, the sound of the streets had changed. Funk no longer ruled the airwaves. Hip-hop, slick modern R&B, and polished pop were taking over radio and TV. In that shifting landscape, Rick James and Prince drifted down two very different paths. Rick slid back into the temptations that had always haunted him: cocaine, heavy drinking, non-stop excess. The blazing stages that once crowned him king of punk funk began to disappear, replaced by cramped courtrooms, mugshots, and sentencing hearings. The world that had cheered his name now mostly read about him in police reports. His legendary persona, once wrapped in leather, smoke, and bass lines, started to fade. Instead of being introduced as a pioneer of funk, he became the cautionary tale, a man whose fame had curdled into scandal, whose empire had collapsed into addiction and chaos. The same funk world that had once crowned him slowly moved on, leaving Rick as a shadow walking through the ruins of his own myth. Prince walked a different road. While mainstream trends shifted, he pulled back from the public in a way that felt deliberate, almost surgical. Paisley Park in Minnesota transformed into a fortress part studio, part palace, part sealed-off kingdom. According to people who worked with him, young musicians, friends, and employees all had to adjust to strict rules the moment they crossed its threshold. Schedules were dictated from above. Movement was controlled. Privacy around Prince was treated like law. He didn't just control the art, he controlled the environment: who walked where, who spoke when, who had access to which rooms. Doors, lighting, even the direction people entered and exited were said to be part of his carefully curated system. Inside Paisley Park, Prince wasn't just an artist. He was the architect and ruler of his own world. And somewhere inside that private universe, the old feud never fully disappeared. The grudge that had started in Detroit and Los Angeles still lingered in the margins of his story. According to various accounts, Rick James's name was quietly removed from show outlines, tribute ideas, and any official narrative that crossed Prince's desk. It wasn't just dislike. It felt like a controlled erasure, a mark of how seriously Prince guarded his legacy. To some observers, that silence around Rick's name became a symbol, not just of hatred, but of control. It was as if Prince was sending a message. No memory, no rival, no ghost from the past would be allowed to disturb the order he had built. No one would get close enough to rewrite his story. Then came the 2000s, and the contrast turned even darker. For Rick James, the super freak glory of the 1,980 seconds was now just a distant echo buried under a mountain of bad headlines. Instead of being linked to funk innovations or MTV breakthroughs, his name appeared next to words like possession, assault, and sentence. He was arrested multiple times on cocaine charges, his private excess repeatedly spilling into public record. One of the most chilling cases emerged in 1991 when he and his girlfriend were accused of kidnapping and assaulting a woman in a West Hollywood hotel. The case dragged on for years, marking him not as a rebellious star, but as a dangerous, unstable figure. Eventually, the legal battles and convictions landed him in prison, where he stayed until 1996. By the time he was released, he was no longer the same man. Years of heavy cocaine use had carved into his body. Strokes and a failing heart slowly wore him down. The stadium lights that once followed him were gone, replaced by hospital fluorescent bulbs and the hard glare of tabloid headlines. Instead of being remembered as the king of punk funk, he was increasingly framed as a tragic example of self-destruction, a fallen icon buried under the ashes of his own choices. While Rick staggered through that darkness, Prince seemed to move in the opposite direction, deeper into secrecy, deeper into control. Paisley Park became less like a studio and more like a hidden kingdom. He continued to write and record constantly, often releasing music independently, bypassing traditional labels, sometimes even dropping songs anonymously just to see who was paying attention. Late-night shows, surprise gigs, private parties for hand-picked guests, everything happened on his terms, at his chosen hour, under his rules. He reportedly banned filming during performances, ordered staff to regulate how and when fans could enter certain spaces, and even dictated details as small as the color and intensity of individual light bulbs. Nothing was left to chance. Every second inside his domain had to reflect his vision. To many, those layers of control mirrored something deeper in his personality. But to others, they also echoed the old wound with Rick James. After what he had endured in the early 1980 seconds, Prince seemed unwilling to ever again give anyone that much power over his image, his circle, or his name. Meanwhile, Rick's health and reputation continued to collapse. While he navigated prison, rehab, and hospital stays, Prince showed no public sign of softening. There were no reconciliations, no joint statements, no surprise gestures of forgiveness. Even when Rick was struggling for his life, Prince stayed distant, his silence as firm as ever. The more time passed, the clearer that distance looked. According to stories that circulated in the industry, Prince's refusal to acknowledge Rick wasn't just a lingering grudge. It was a kind of boundary, a line drawn in purple ink across his life story. He would not let the chaos of that feud back into his controlled world, no matter how much time had passed or how much Rick had already lost. It was a ruthless contrast. On one side, Rick James, the former king of punk funk, slowly fading under the weight of scandal, illness, and regret. On the other, Prince, sealed inside Paisley Park, carefully curating every sound, every light, every name that entered his orbit. And at the center of that contrast was a single, unhealed wound, a feud that had begun with spilled cognac, stolen love, and a shredded autograph, and had evolved into something much colder, a permanent reminder that Prince would never again allow a rival or the past to breach the walls of his authority. The haunting part was this. While Rick James sat in prison cells and later lay in hospital beds recovering from strokes, Prince never publicly showed pity or reached out a hand for reconciliation. There were no surprise visits, no discreet phone calls, no symbolic gestures of peace. Instead, his distance stayed as sharp as ever, cold, decisive, and deliberate. To many watching from the outside, that silence said more than any interview ever could. It suggested that, in Prince's mind, the old feud from Detroit and Los Angeles was still alive, still smoldering, still too deep to forgive. Paisley Park stood there in Minnesota like a sealed temple, and Prince lived inside it as if he were guarding not just his music, but his memories. He rarely spoke Rick's name. He didn't need to. According to people around him, every choice he made, from the shows he did approve to the tributes he refused, quietly reinforced one message: I am still here. You are not. It was a brutal contrast. Rick James, once the explosive king of punk funk, faded beneath the weight of scandal, addiction, and failing health. Prince, on the other hand, stepped further into his purple fortress, tightening control over every sound, every image, every story attached to his legacy. Where Rick's life spiraled outward into chaos, Prince's world spiraled inward into control and isolation. Then came the 21st of April, 2016. The sky over Minneapolis was gray and heavy when the news broke. Inside Paisley Park, the stronghold of purple funk Prince was found collapsed in an elevator. The official findings later pointed to a fentanyl overdose, a powerful opioid painkiller he had reportedly been using to manage years of relentless hip and back pain. Just like that, the man who had turned silence into a weapon was suddenly silent forever. The world reacted instantly. Outside Paisley Park, fans gathered with candles, photos, and deep purple flowers. The gates transformed into a wall of grief. Across TV screens and front pages, the headlines called it the loss of a legend, a wound to music that could never be fully healed. Old performances resurfaced. Clips of him shredding guitar and dancing under violet lights played on loop. People who had grown up with his songs felt like a piece of their own history had been torn away. But underneath the mourning, another truth lingered, one that never made the official memorials. Prince's story didn't just end with unreleased tracks, innovative performances, and fearless experiments. It also ended with a feud that, according to many accounts, had never really been put to rest. Rick James had already died in 2004, years before Prince. Yet, in Prince's behavior, the scar from their conflict seemed to remain stubbornly open. People in the industry whispered about one moment in particular. They said that, a few years before his death, when Prince was allegedly approached about participating in a Rick James tribute, he answered with only 3 words: "Not even dead." Those 3 words, if the reports were accurate, hung in the air like a verdict, short, simple, and heavier than any insult they had ever traded in life. It wasn't just a refusal to attend an event. It was a final statement. Rick James, in Prince's universe, would never be forgiven. Not in youth, not in old age, not even after death. Rick had humiliated Prince in front of peers and strangers, from the cognac incident to mocking him through stage stunts. Prince, in response, had used silence, strategy, and success to push Rick into the role of the bitter outsider. Every attack, from the stolen lover to the funeral wreath, from the overlapping tour dates to the anonymous flyers, had built toward one brutal conclusion: there would be no truce. When Prince died, much of the world chose to remember him as a near saint of pop and funk, a mysterious genius wrapped in purple mystique. Tributes focused on his artistry, his activism, his catalog. But if you looked closer at the shadows of his life, a harsher detail remained. Somewhere inside that guarded soul, there appeared to be a space carved out for Rick James, not as a friend, not as an equal, but as a permanent enemy. And those rumored 3 words, "not even dead," became the last icy echo of a feud that had outlived one of its participants and still clung to the other. The most unsettling truth is that Rick's hatred may have helped shape Prince's way of being. The betrayal, the insults, the mockery, and the constant comparisons didn't just upset him, they molded his defenses. They nudged him toward isolation, toward micromanaging every corner of his world, toward believing that he alone truly understood the weight of fame, creativity, and power. The more he locked the doors of Paisley Park, the more it looked like he was building a fortress not just against the industry, but against ever facing another Rick James again. It influenced how he chose his inner circle, how he controlled his narrative, how he guarded his privacy like a fragile relic. Even near the end, Prince left an unspoken reminder: no rival, no betrayal, and no ghost from the past, especially not Rick James, would be allowed into his private kingdom. In the end, the feud didn't just live in their minds. It rooted itself in the memories of fans, in the stories journalists retold, in the way people hear certain songs. It became part of the mythology of American music, a dark thread woven through the glittering fabric of funk and pop history. Proof that in the world of stars, some conflicts outlive the people who started them. Every time Super Freak blares from a speaker, every time the opening chords of 1999 roll out at a party, there's more than just nostalgia in the air. There's an echo, a ghost of 2 men locked in a war that neither was willing to end. Their feud became a red streak across Prince's career, a wound that never fully closed. A reminder that even as he left behind vaults of unreleased recordings and unforgettable performances, he also left behind one story with no reconciliation. Prince's legacy is larger than any single rivalry, but it cannot completely escape it. It includes the thousands of songs left in his vault, the fearless shows, the innovations in sound and performance, and one unforgiven feud. A silent promise that control, distance, and resentment can sometimes last longer than life itself. In Prince's story, Rick James is like a red mark on a white canvas, a small dot that still draws the eye, a wound that refused to heal, a memory that even death couldn't erase. That is why, whenever we talk about funk, whenever we replay those anthems that defined entire eras, the sound carries more than just rhythm. It carries the shadow of a lifelong war. And in that long, tangled history, Rick James is not just a rival or a collaborator gone wrong. He stands as the man Prince never forgave. But what about you? When you look back over the spilled cognac, the stolen lover, the broken autograph, the funeral wreath, and the silent revenge, which moment do you believe truly made Rick James swear he would never forgive Prince?